Derek wants to keep it small, just his parents. That was the message my daughter sent me at 9:12 on a quiet Tuesday morning, and I remember staring at those words longer than I should have, as if reading them again might somehow rearrange their meaning into something less final, less precise, less excluding. I was standing in my kitchen at the time, the coffee maker humming softly, the scent of fresh brew filling the air just like it had every morning for the past 35 years, and for a moment, everything felt exactly the same as it always had, until it didn't. I read the message again, then again, just as parents. I set my phone down on the counter, then picked it up almost immediately, as if it might disappear if I looked away too long. My reflection caught in the microwave door, silver hair neatly brushed, cardigan buttoned all the way up, the same woman who had packed Derek's school lunches, who had sat through every parent-teacher conference, who had stayed up nights when he had the flu, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead while whispering that everything would be okay. I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe Laura had misworded it. Maybe Derek meant something else. Maybe this wasn't what it sounded like. But the words were simple, clean, intentional. I glanced toward the dining table where I had already started making a list that morning. Things to bring, what to wear, whether I should bake the apple pie Derek always loved or the pecan one Emily once complimented. I had been so certain there would be an invitation. There always had been. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners that stretched long into the evening. I had never needed to ask. I had always just belonged. My phone buzzed again, and for a second, my heart lifted, foolishly hopeful that there would be a correction, a follow-up message, something that would soften what I had just read. But it was only a photo. Laura had sent it without a caption. I tapped it open. A long dining table, beautifully set, white plates, gold accents, candles already arranged even though the sun was still up. I recognized the house immediately. It was Emily's parents' place, the one with the tall windows and the manicured lawn that always looked like it belonged in a magazine. There were place cards neatly lined along the table. I zoomed in without thinking, my fingers moving slowly, carefully, as if I were afraid of what I might see. Emily, Derek, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, Laura, even a cousin or two. My name wasn't there. I didn't feel anything at first. Not anger, not sadness, just a kind of stillness, like the moment right before a storm when the air goes quiet and heavy and you know something is coming, even if you can't yet see it. I set the phone back down and turned off the coffee maker before it finished brewing. The kitchen suddenly felt too large, too empty, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall louder than it had ever been. Just his parents. I repeated under my breath, testing the sentence out loud this time, as if hearing it might help me understand it better. But it didn't. It only made one question settle deeper into my chest, heavier with each passing second. If Derek was keeping it just his parents, then who, exactly, did he think I was? I did not reply to Laura right away. I set my phone face down on the counter and stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the ordinary sounds of a house that had once been full and now felt like it was holding its breath. It had been 3 years since my husband passed, 3 years since this house had shifted from a place of laughter and shared routines into something quieter, more careful. After the funeral, Derek had promised he would visit more often. He said he did not want me to feel alone. And for a while, he did. Sunday afternoons, short visits, sometimes just long enough to drink a cup of coffee and check his phone before leaving again. I never complained. I told myself he had his own life now, his own responsibilities, and that was how it was supposed to be. When Emily came into the picture, things changed in ways that were easy to explain at first. Holidays became more complicated. There were other families to consider, other traditions. Dinners were rescheduled, then shortened, then quietly forgotten. I remember the first Thanksgiving after they got engaged. I had set the table for 4, even though I knew they might not come. By 5 o'clock, the turkey was already resting on the counter, the gravy thickening in the pan, and my phone still silent. Later that evening, Derek called and said they had gone to Emily's parents' house instead, that it had just been easier that way. I told him it was fine. I even said I understood. I always said I understood. Over time, the invitations became less frequent, then more formal, as if I were no longer part of something automatic, but something that needed to be arranged, confirmed, approved. There were moments I noticed small things, details that did not quite sit right. A birthday dinner where I found out about the time change from a social media post instead of a call. A family photo where I was told afterward that it had been a last-minute decision. A weekend trip they mentioned only after they had already returned. Each time, there was an explanation. Each time, I accepted it. Standing in my kitchen now, I began to see those moments differently, not as isolated oversights, but as pieces of something more deliberate, something quiet and careful that had been unfolding around me without ever announcing itself. I picked up my phone again and opened the message thread with Laura, my thumb hovering over the screen as I tried to decide what to say. There were so many questions I could have asked, but none of them felt right. Instead, I scrolled back through older messages, looking at the pattern I had never named before. Short replies, delayed responses, conversations that ended before they really began. I realized then that nothing had changed overnight. There had been no single moment when I stopped being included. It had happened gradually, politely, almost gently, and that was what made it so difficult to see. I walked over to the dining table and slowly folded the list I had written that morning, the one with Derek's favorite pie circled twice. I placed it neatly in the drawer, smoothing the edges as if it still mattered. Outside, a car passed by, its tires brushing softly against the pavement, and for a brief second, I imagined it pulling into my driveway, imagined Derek stepping out, explaining everything, telling me there had been a mistake. But the sound faded, and the driveway remained empty. I looked around the house, at the photographs on the wall, at the years I had spent building something I thought would always include me, and I felt that same stillness return, deeper now, clearer. It was not confusion anymore. It was recognition. I waited until the afternoon light shifted across the kitchen floor before I finally pressed Derek's name on my phone, watching it ring as I stood by the window, my fingers resting lightly against the glass as if I needed something steady to hold on to. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice familiar but distant, like hearing someone speak from another room with the door half closed. "Hey, Mom," he said, casual, almost distracted, and for a moment I wondered if he already knew why I was calling. I did not mention the message right away. Instead, I asked him how he was, how work had been, the same small questions I had asked him for years, the kind that once led to long conversations but now seemed to settle into short, careful answers. He told me things were busy, that there was a lot going on, and I nodded even though he could not see me, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the real reason to rise to the surface. "Laura sent me something this morning," I said finally, keeping my voice even, the way I had learned to do over time. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough. "Oh," he replied, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have said. I could almost picture him, glancing toward Emily, measuring his response before giving it. "About the dinner," I added, offering him a way to step into the conversation without forcing it open. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat softly. "It is just something small, Mom. Nothing big. Just keeping it simple." I listened to the way he said it, the careful choice of words, the way he avoided anything that might sound too definite, and I realized he had already practiced this explanation in his head. "Just his parents," I repeated, not as a question, but as a statement, letting the words settle between us. Another pause followed, heavier this time. "It is just easier this way," he said, and there it was again, that phrase I had heard before, the one that always sounded reasonable on the surface, and yet left something unspoken underneath. I looked out at the yard, at the small garden I had tended for years, the one Derek used to help me water when he was little, his sneakers always too big for his feet as he tried to keep up with me. "Easier for who?" I asked quietly, not accusing, not demanding, just asking. He did not answer right away, and in that silence, I understood more than any explanation could have given me. "It is not a big deal, Mom," he said after a moment, his tone softening as if he were trying to reassure me, or perhaps himself. "We will do something together another time." I nodded again, even though he still could not see me, and felt a strange calm settle in, the kind that comes not from comfort, but from clarity. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, almost gentle. "Whatever works best." We spoke for a few more minutes after that, about nothing in particular, about the weather, about a new project he was working on, and then the call ended as simply as it had begun. I lowered the phone slowly and stood there for a moment, replaying his words, not searching for hidden meaning anymore, but recognizing exactly what had been said and what had not. It was not confusion anymore. It was confirmation. That evening, I did not turn on the television like I usually did. The house remained quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer felt peaceful but observant, as if it had begun to notice what I had finally allowed myself to see. I moved slowly through the rooms, not searching for anything in particular, just letting my eyes rest on the details I had stopped questioning over the past few years. The framed photographs on the hallway wall caught my attention first. There was one from Derek's college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling into the sun, and another from his 30th birthday, a crowded table, candles lit, laughter frozen in a moment that had once felt permanent. I stepped closer, studying those images as if they belonged to someone else's life, trying to pinpoint exactly when that version of us had begun to fade. It was not sudden. It never is. It had been a series of small adjustments, subtle shifts that I had explained away. At the time, I remembered the first Christmas after Derek and Emily got married. I had spent days preparing, wrapping gifts, setting the table with the same care I always had, expecting them in the afternoon. Instead, I received a call that morning. Plans had changed. They would be spending the entire day with Emily's family, but they would try to stop by later if they could. They did not. I told myself it was normal, that newly married couples needed to find their own traditions. The following year, I was invited, but only for dessert. The year after that, I was asked to come earlier, before the rest of Emily's relatives arrived, as if my presence needed to be scheduled around something else, something more important. At the time, I accepted each change as reasonable, even thoughtful in its own way. Now, standing there in the dim light of the hallway, I began to see those moments not as compromises, but as quiet rearrangements, careful edits to a place I once held without question. I walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Derek used to curl up in when he was small, his head resting against my shoulder as we read together in the evenings. The cushion still dipped slightly in the same spot, as if it remembered him even if he no longer returned to it. I folded my hands in my lap and let the memories come without trying to stop them, each one clearer than the last. The time Emily suggested they celebrate Derek's birthday at a restaurant without telling me until the next day. The weekend trip they took for their anniversary that I learned about from a neighbor who had seen their pictures online. The way Derek had started to say we already made plans, instead of let me check with you. None of it had felt like rejection on its own. That was the subtlety of it. Each moment was small enough to dismiss, gentle enough to accept. But together, they formed something undeniable. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just aware. The pattern was no longer something I could ignore or soften with explanations. It was clear now, precise in a way that left no room for doubt. I had not been pushed out all at once. I had been moved, quietly and consistently, until I no longer stood where I once did. And the most unsettling part was not that it had happened, but that I had allowed myself to believe, for so long, that it had not. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep no longer held the same weight it once did. The house felt different in the daylight, less heavy but more exposed, as if everything I had begun to understand the night before was now standing in plain view, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I moved through my usual routine with quiet precision, making my bed, folding the blanket just the way I always had, pouring a cup of coffee, and setting it on the table without immediately drinking it. There was no rush, no interruption, no one else's schedule to consider. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like something I needed to fill. It felt like space. I sat down at the table and looked at my phone, not with anticipation this time, but with a kind of calm distance, as if it had become an object rather than a connection. There were no new messages from Derek. No follow-up. No correction. That absence, more than anything, confirmed what I had already begun to accept. I reached for a small notebook I kept in the drawer beside me, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and opened it to a blank page. For a moment, I simply held the pen in my hand, unsure of what I intended to write, only knowing that I needed to place something outside of my thoughts, something concrete. Slowly, I began listing dates. Not all of them, just the ones that stood out clearly now, the ones that had once seemed ordinary but no longer felt that way. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Derek's birthday, the weekend trip, the dinner I had not been invited to. One by one, they formed a quiet timeline, not dramatic, not loud, but consistent. I paused, looking at the page, noticing how evenly spaced the entries were, how deliberate the pattern appeared when it was no longer softened by explanation. My hand rested on the paper as I considered something I had not allowed myself to consider before. This had not been confusion. It had not been miscommunication. It had been a decision. Perhaps not a single, spoken decision, but a series of choices made over time, each one small enough to pass unnoticed, but together shaping something very clear. I closed the notebook gently and set it aside, not because I was finished, but because I understood enough for now. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was what I would do with it. I stood up and walked to the hallway again, stopping in front of the photographs, but this time I did not search for what had been lost. I looked at them for what they were, moments that existed, memories that could not be rewritten, even if the present had changed. My eyes moved from one frame to the next until they settled on a smaller photo near the end of the row, one I had not paid much attention to before. It was taken in the backyard, Derek standing beside me, both of us covered in dirt from planting flowers, laughing at something I could no longer remember. There was no one else in the picture, no audience, no arrangement, just the two of us, exactly as we were. I studied that image for a long moment, then turned away, not with sadness, but with a quiet certainty that had not been there before. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and opened my contacts, my finger hovering briefly before scrolling past Derek's name. Instead, I selected another number, one I had not called in some time. As it began to ring, I felt something shift inside me, subtle but steady, like a door that had been closed for years finally opening just enough to let light through. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to explain myself. I only needed to stop waiting. The call connected on the third ring, and for a brief moment, I almost hung up, not out of doubt, but out of habit, the old instinct to step back before fully stepping forward. But I did not. Hello, the voice on the other end said, warm but cautious, and I realized how long it had been since I had reached out first instead of waiting. Hi, Susan, I said, my voice steady, almost unfamiliar in. It's calm. There was a pause, then a soft shift in her tone, recognition settling in. Margaret? Is everything all right? It was a simple question, one that used to invite a careful answer, something polite, something that would not trouble anyone. This time, I did not rush to soften it. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch this week, I said, choosing my words slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to be clear. Another pause followed, but this one felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, just thoughtful. I would like that, she replied, and there was something in her voice, something genuine, that I had not realized I had been missing. We settled on Thursday, a small place downtown that we used to visit years ago, before life became divided into schedules that no longer included me. After the call ended, I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, noticing how quiet the house remained, and yet how different that quiet felt now. It was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was allowing something new to begin. I placed the phone down gently and walked to the window, looking out at the street as a breeze moved through the trees, their branches shifting softly against the pale morning sky. For the first time in a long while, I was not looking outward in expectation. I was simply observing. The rest of the day unfolded without urgency. I moved through it with intention, not filling the hours with distractions, but allowing each moment to exist without being measured against what it used to be. I opened the closet and selected a few pieces of clothing I had not worn in years, not because they were old, but because there had never seemed to be a reason to wear them. I ran my fingers over the fabric, remembering when I had first bought them, small decisions made for myself rather than for anyone else. In the afternoon, I sat at the dining table again, but this time I did not write a list of what I might bring or prepare for someone else. Instead, I wrote down the address of the restaurant, the time we had agreed on, and then, almost without thinking, I added something else beneath it. A name, then another. People I had not spoken to in a while. People I had once been close to before my world quietly narrowed into something smaller than I had realized. I did not feel regret as I looked at those names. I felt possibility. As the light began to fade, I walked through the house once more, but not as someone searching for what had been lost. I turned off the lights in rooms I was not using, straightened a chair, adjusted a frame slightly on the wall, small actions that felt less like maintenance and more like reclaiming. When I reached the front door, I paused, my hand resting lightly on the handle, not opening it, not leaving, just acknowledging that it was there, that I could. Behind me, the house remained quiet. Ahead of me, the evening settled in, calm and open. And for the first time, I understood that I did not need to be invited to belong somewhere. I could decide that for myself. Thursday arrived with a quiet kind of certainty, the kind that does not rush you but meets you where you are, steady and unassuming. I took my time getting ready, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I chose a soft gray sweater and a pair of slacks I had not worn in years, smoothing the fabric as I looked at myself in the mirror, noticing not what had changed, but what had remained. There was a calm in my expression that had not been there before, something settled, something decided. The drive into town felt familiar in a distant way, like revisiting a place you once knew well, but had not allowed yourself to return to. The streets, the storefronts, the small details I used to pass without thinking now seemed clearer, more present, as if I had been moving through them half aware before and was only now seeing them fully. When I arrived at the restaurant, Susan was already there, seated near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her posture relaxed but attentive. She stood when she saw me, her face softening into a genuine smile that did not feel practiced or polite, just real. "Margaret," she said, and there was warmth in the way she said my name, a kind of recognition that did not need explanation. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no urgency to fill the space. It felt different from the conversations I had grown used to, where words were often used to avoid what was not being said. Here, the silence was not something to move past. It was something to sit within. We talked about simple things at first, about the weather, about the changes in town, about people we both knew years ago. But even in those small exchanges, there was a steadiness, a sense that I did not need to measure my words or soften my presence to fit into the moment. At one point, Susan looked at me for a little longer than usual, her expression thoughtful. "You seem different," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. I considered that for a moment, not rushing to answer, letting the truth settle before I spoke. "I think I finally see things clearly," I replied, my voice even, not heavy, not defensive, just honest. She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than I had said. We did not need to go into details. There was no need to explain the messages, the silences, the careful exclusions that had shaped the past few years. Somehow, sitting there, I realized that not everything needed to be revisited in order to be understood. After lunch, we stepped outside together, the air cool but comfortable, the kind of afternoon that invited you to linger a little longer than planned. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not rushing to say goodbye. "We should do this again," Susan said, and I could hear that she meant it, not as a polite ending, but as a genuine intention. "I would like that," I replied, and this time, I knew I meant it too. As I walked back to my car, I felt something shift again, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but steadily, like a foundation settling into place after being quietly adjusted. I was no longer standing in the space I had been pushed out of. I was standing somewhere new, somewhere I had chosen. And as I drove home, the thought that had once felt heavy now felt clear and simple. I did not need to return to where I had been excluded. I could move forward without asking for permission. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not go straight inside. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the way the sunlight stretched across the driveway, longer now than it had been just a few hours earlier. There was no rush to move, no expectation waiting behind the front door. For the first time in a long while, coming home did not feel like returning to a place of absence. It felt like arriving somewhere I understood. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the path, noticing small details I had overlooked before, the way the wind shifted through the trees, the faint sound of a neighbor's radio in the distance, the steady rhythm of a life continuing, with or without my place in someone else's plans. Inside, the house greeted me with the same quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt settled, as if it had been waiting for me to see it clearly, just as it was. I set my keys down on the table and moved into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned lightly against the counter. My phone buzzed then, a single vibration that echoed more than it should have in the stillness. I glanced at the screen. Derek. For a brief moment, I simply looked at his name, not reaching for the phone immediately, not reacting the way I once would have, with urgency, with readiness. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had not heard in a while. Something uncertain, something searching. I did not fill the silence for him. "Hey," I replied, calm, steady. There was a pause, and I could almost feel him deciding how to begin. "I just wanted to check in," he said finally. "See how you were doing." I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me, recognizing the careful distance in his words, the way they hovered just above what he actually meant. "I am doing well," I said, and I realized as I said it that it was true. Another pause followed, longer this time. "About the dinner," he started, then stopped, as if the rest of the sentence did not quite know how to form itself. I waited not to pressure him, but because I no longer felt the need to guide him through his own explanation. "It is just complicated," he added, his voice softer now. I walked over to the window, looking out at the yard, at the same space that had once held questions I no longer needed answered. "I understand," I said quietly, and I meant it, but not in the way I had meant it before. This was not the understanding that made room for someone else's decisions at the cost of my own place. This was clarity. "We can plan something later," he said, almost quickly, as if offering a solution that might restore something that had already shifted. I rested my hand against the edge of the window frame, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers. "That will not be necessary," I replied, my voice gentle but certain. There was silence on the other end, not tense, not sharp, just still. "What do you mean?" he asked after a moment. I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to allow the words to settle into exactly what they needed to be. "I mean that you should have your evening exactly the way you want it," I said. "And I will have mine." I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. I did not ask for anything in return. The quiet that followed was different this time, not filled with things unsaid, but with something understood. "Okay," he said finally, his voice lower now, as if something had shifted on his end as well. We ended the call shortly after, without tension, without resolution, but with something else in its place. I set the phone down and remained by the window, looking out at the same yard, the same trees, the same quiet afternoon. Nothing around me had changed, and yet everything had. That evening arrived quietly, without announcement, the way most things do when they no longer need to prove themselves. I did not check the time more than once, did not glance at my phone to see if there were messages waiting, did not stand in the kitchen wondering what I should have been preparing. Instead, I moved through my home with a sense of ease that felt unfamiliar but right, as if I had stepped into a version of my life that had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. I set the table for one, not out of loneliness, but with intention, placing a single plate at the center, a glass of water beside it, the soft clink of each movement echoing gently in the quiet space. I chose a simple meal, something I enjoyed, something I had not made in a while, because it had never been anyone else's favorite. As I sat down, I realized there was no weight attached to the moment, no comparison to what might have been happening somewhere else, no need to imagine the table I was not sitting at. For the first time, I was not measuring my place against someone else's decision. I was simply present in my own. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of blue and gray, the last light of the day fading slowly, and I allowed myself to watch it, not as a distraction, but as something worth noticing. My phone remained on the counter, silent, untouched, and I did not feel the pull to check it. Whatever was happening elsewhere no longer defined what this evening meant for me. After dinner, I cleared the table at an unhurried pace, rinsing each dish, placing it carefully in the rack, the rhythm of it steady and grounding. I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room, settling into the armchair by the window, the same one that had once held so many shared moments, but now held something different, something entirely my own. I did not feel replaced. I did not feel forgotten. Those words no longer carried the same meaning. What I felt was clarity, a quiet understanding that belonging is not something that can be taken away by a single message or a carefully worded exclusion. It is something you either recognize within yourself or spend years waiting for someone else to grant you. I had spent a long time waiting. Too long. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer watching me. It was simply there, steady and unchanged, a place that had held every version of me, including this one. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of peace, letting the stillness settle around me without resistance. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its sound fading quickly, leaving the night undisturbed. I opened my eyes again and looked around, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. Nothing had been returned to me. Nothing had been fixed or explained. And yet, something had shifted in a way that no conversation could have created. I had stopped waiting for a seat at someone else's table. And in doing that, I had finally taken my own.